Welcome to the Restitutor Orbis channel. Our mainstream account tells us that in the earliest days of our civilization we built pyramids during the Bronze Age. After the Bronze Age, we slowly advanced to the time of the Roman Republic that eventually became the Roman Empire, and the sort of structures that we built changed radically. We advanced to building smaller structures that were not quite as geometrically precise as the earlier pyramids, and yet they're very fine structures with great domes and magnificent colossal forms to them that endure to this day. And let's also take time to appreciate the wondrous Roman roads, many of which that also continue to endure to this day. Everywhere we go around the land, we'll see the ruins of the previous civilization. And yes, that includes the United States and the Americas, even though it's called the New World. Although new as opposed to what is certainly a question of the day. Today we're going to examine the 5 eras theory. The channel originally started with the charter of examining numerous different theories. And you can go back and watch the video that's linked in the description of this video called The Grand Theories of Tartaria and the Old World, in which we explored the many different theories that could explain the existence of pre-existing civilizations that were not explained in the mainstream. Think about the aspect of a cemetery. You believe that a cemetery gives you validation that the history that you're told is accurate because every time someone you know passes away, they're buried in a cemetery with a date that's left on the tombstone. Therefore, older tombstones must be validation that what happened in the past historical account is accurate. Although would you be surprised to know that virtually every cemetery across the lands has been moved at some point in time for a variety of reasons. We have now advanced to building wondrous towers of glass and steel that cross the land. And yet, can we actually build these incredible pyramids that we did in the distant past during the Bronze Age? How does the mainstream account explain the construction of these pyramids? Indeed, we are derided for even questioning the account that we're given for how the pyramids were constructed. We are derided and told that it's merely a conspiracy theory. Yet at the same time, the mainstream tries to explain the pyramids with theories. In other words, they don't know for sure. But it's okay for them to come up with theories because their theories are validated by scientists, historians, archaeologists, and all the individuals with the appropriate credentials to do such things. So you look at the pyramids and you'll see that it's made up of many large stones that had to be moved. And they explain this by telling us that the quarries were nearby. They also have these wondrous images that we have that show human labor moving these great blocks. And then we have these beautiful animations that show us how they used a wonderful waterworks project to move these blocks and set them in place. And doesn't that illustration look great of those giant colossal people? And when you look at these illustrations and you have this wonderful account that tells you that water may have moved the blocks in place with human labor, it suddenly seems very believable, and you'll just accept it without asking questions. Of course, this image looks ridiculous. We could never build the pyramids like this today. So if we can't do it with human labor, and we base everything on this supposed representation from a governor of Egypt that existed 2,000 years before the year 0, or so we're told, and then it was some Greek individual who came up with a theory on how they moved the blocks using ramps, even though he was theorizing about an event that occurred 2,000 years before he was alive, and then this Greek individual is also 2,000 years before our current time, I don't see any issues with the mainstream account of the pyramids. Now, if you want a different theory, we're going to examine the 5 eras theory. The 5 eras theory examines the fact that there are civilizations that came before ours that we don't discuss, that the mainstream does not acknowledge. And the reason for that being is that because if you actually acknowledge the existence of other civilizations where people lived in a different fashion, then it completely detracts from your ability to maintain your control over the population. The eras that we talk about the most and we'll examine on the channel are the contemporary era, our current era, the 5th era, and the 4th era, or also known as the Tartarian era or the Monument era. These are the most dramatic eras to talk about, and we also have the most evidence. But we're also going to consider the foundation eras, the 1st through the 3rd eras. And we call them the foundation eras because they were the original foundations that both the 4th era and the 5th era were built on top of. And we can still see their remnants. Indeed, we speculate that the pyramids are actually the remnants of the 2nd era civilization, or the foundation era. And yet there are other examples of incredible geometric structures that endure. Consider what we have in the 5th era with our great cities of glass and steel, and yet something about them seems very disposable and uninspired. What's the primary form of architecture? We have nothing but wonderful brutalist architecture. Brutalist architecture, called as such because it is functional, and it's also cost-effective. What's truly intriguing to consider, though, about the prospect of brutalist architecture is how it's risen across the world, and its heyday was considered after World War II in both the United States and the Soviet Union. And despite the fact that these were two diametrically opposed ideologies and nations, for a variety of reasons, they somehow embraced the same type of architecture, supposedly at different times and for different reasons that happen to support their respective economic systems. Even in Pittsburgh, where we saw the beautiful Cathedral of Learning, we have this wonderful glass tower that we can look at and we can act like it really compares with the Cathedral of Learning. And then we have many other wondrous structures where great residences live in. It looks nice and rounded and cubed and very, very boring. Sometimes you have to remember, though, that there is inspired architecture in brutalist architecture. It looks like we have what appears to be some sort of broken down TIE fighter here. And what does it represent? I don't know. Looking at the rest of the architecture, you need go no further than consider the dystopian film A Clockwork Orange. A Clockwork Orange, which talked about how a society repressed and controlled an individual, and it used this architecture quite effectively to show how individuals were controlled and how ultimately the violence that was inflicted on others was all at the behest of the government. And if you pay attention to the subtext in the movie A Clockwork Orange, you'll see that the architecture plays no small part in representing that. And there's no doubt about it that brutalist architecture can certainly reflect a dystopian flavor to a society, if you will. Now, is this going a little too far? Is this being a little too harsh on brutalist architecture? It has its place, it's functional, and it's cheap. At least that's what we'll be told. Although there are conflicting accounts given as to why it was embraced. For example, you'll be told that in the Western world, the United States, brutalist architecture was embraced because it was cheaper, and there was a demand for residences. And then in the Soviet Union, or the so-called communist bloc at the time, you'll be told that brutalist architecture was embraced because it was all for the good of the state, and it was for allowing individuals and workers to all have the same standard of living. And as much as we believe both of these diametrically opposed ideologies embracing the exact same architecture as the main reason for why we have numerous examples of brutalist architecture, we see that it represents the Fifth Era. And in fact, many offshoots of what they used to call brutalist architecture still exist to this day. And you need look no further in the United States than a Holiday Inn Express or any of these newer modern hotels or residential areas, where you can find that it's not really dystopian living, it's merely common sense. It makes perfect sense. It's cheaper. And it's always good to have disposable buildings. It's also good to have buildings with the fine functional lines of brutalism in the background for when you're engaging on your individual walks for fun. But why is brutalist architecture considered something that's an advancement? For two reasons. One, we're told that it reflected the economic realities in the entire world from the 1950s to the 1970s. And two, we're just told that it's a lot more practical. We don't want to build architecture that has an artistic appeal to it. Practicality, cost savings, and being economically viable. That's what really matters. And when you have a lot of people that need housing, you're going to shove them in very block-like housing units that all look the same. And this will inspire people. And indeed, the actual housing units that were used to film A Clockwork Orange still have that same dystopian look to them in the present. Now, it's my opinion. Perhaps this is a utopian appearance to you. Perhaps you think that that beautiful Freedom Tower in New York City is an improvement over the structures that preceded it. We've looked at the skyline of New York City in the early 20th century. And tell me, is there a comparison? Do any of these many residential high-rises actually compare to the previous residences that we had all over the Western world and the Eastern world from the times past? We'll be told that this was merely a necessity, that this was done for the good of people, that this represented the will of the people, not just in the United States, but in the Soviet Union. Now let's look at the Art Deco question. Is Art Deco from the Fifth Era or the Fourth Era? Art Deco is very intriguing because it has conflicting accounts for what it really represents. It has conflicting accounts for what styles actually go into Art Deco. When we look at Art Deco, though, we see something very different than brutalist or postmodern. We see an architectural style that reflects artistic inspiration, something that reflects a civilization that genuinely cares about the structures that it's building, that the structures are supposed to have more of a function than just be utilitarian, as we're relentlessly told that brutalist architecture serves. We see a style and a beauty in these Art Deco buildings that seem to speak to the human spirit. When you look at these buildings, you can't help but be impressed, and you feel that a lot more effort was put into their exterior and interior designs. You actually see the fact that there is the true human spirit that's reflected in these buildings. And oftentimes people will try to convince you that these buildings were all easily built primarily in the United States during the 1920s, and you can even find a great example of one built in the Soviet Union in the 1940s to the early 1950s. Yet, looking at the Art Deco style, you can see that there is something about it that is always awe-inspiring. And it's very difficult to accept the explanation that all these buildings were built with these very wonderful and convincing construction photos that we have. And even though this was only about 100 years ago, it still falls in a very ambiguous time. Did our civilization build these buildings? Or are we simply told that they built these buildings? How much of a deception do we have with the actual timeline? And can we really validate or verify anything? Now, it's very interesting to me because since I've done many of these explorations and we've primarily looked at many cities in the United States, we've started to look at cities in Europe and in Asia, we always have the same explanation and always have the same things that you see in the comments. And I'm going to let you in on something. There's actually a comment somebody could make that would convince me over 90% that any one of these Art Deco buildings were built by our civilization. But it's quite fascinating that not a single person has ever made that comment. And it's really quite simple, and I'm not going to tell you what that comment is. I'll let you know if somebody makes the comment, but you can find an example of it in one of the videos concerning an Iowa exploration because somebody made a comment that very convincingly showed that the 801 Grand Building in Des Moines was built by our civilization. And yet there's so many questions that come up with these Art Deco buildings. They continue to show the aspect of the civilization that preceded ours. I believe that by and large, most of these structures are from the 4th era, or the Tartarian civilization that preceded our 5th era. And why do I think that? Because these buildings do reflect the style of what we would call the Old World. They have that artistic spirit, that inspiration in every single one of them. And it's not just on the exteriors of the buildings, it's also in the interior where you see how they reflect the once grandeur of civilization. A civilization that cared about the individual, not constantly being in a state of function or a state of misery, but being able to inspire the spirit on the inside. No doubt when you're in an Art Deco building as opposed to when you're in a brutalist architecture building, you can tell the difference. You can also compare and contrast how you feel when you stand outside an Art Deco building as opposed to a brutalist building. And when you see some of the examples of Art Deco, the explanation you'll be given from architects is that they had more of an artistic flair in the 1920s to incorporate all these incredible styles that even include Egyptian, strangely enough, because we do recall the civil courts building in St. Louis that we looked at that was modeled after the mausoleum of Helicarnassus, which supposedly doesn't have anything to do with Egypt, but it does. And that's according to the mainstream account. There's always these beautiful reliefs that also accompany Art Deco. The wondrous figures that you see depicted on the outside of the buildings. And these buildings have many different functions. Some are office buildings, some are municipal buildings, some are memorials, yet the style is reflected in the same. And while they try to tell us exactly what it's supposed to reflect, and of course they give us the hand wave explanation that the reason it reflects every civilization and culture across the world is because of course it incorporates every civilization and culture across the world. That's how you explain Art Deco. It's not because it's actually from a civilization that encompassed all the known lands. It's because somebody was trying to achieve cultural understanding in the 1920s, especially in the United States. The interiors of some of these buildings continue to inspire us. Now, why do I acknowledge the fact that some of these buildings may be questionable? Because we constantly run across the situation where we're told, we are assured in the same manner with repeated statements that many of these buildings, and here we look at the main building of the Moscow University, a questionable building, we're told that this individual, Joseph Stalin, was responsible for its construction. And once Joseph Stalin had passed on, then the Soviet Union completely embraced brutalist architecture. Indeed, it's an individual that we always explain it. Remember during the Kansas City exploration where we saw some very stunning Art Deco buildings, including the Power and Light building in the aptly named Power and Light district within Kansas City. I would be interested to see someone actually be able to build a building like this today. I would like to see someone build this very impressive theater that still endures with this very unique dome, again in Kansas City. Interesting patterns that we see in the windows, and of course the type of construction material that was used to establish the walls and the dome itself. And let's not forget the Kansas City Hall. The Kansas City Hall also being a stellar example of Art Deco. And where do you see it? You see it in the art reliefs, and you also see it in the walls of the building going all the way to the top. So you can prove that there is a skyscraper that's a lot more than just a functional building. You can see there are aspects of it that truly reflect a different civilization, unless we're to believe it's our own civilization. Kansas City has its own version of Joseph Stalin, Tom Pendergast. Tom Pendergast, who was a mafia and political machine organizer in Kansas City and supposedly responsible for the presidency of Harry S. Truman. Of course, it didn't save this particular individual from serving time in prison for tax evasion. So really, was Joseph Stalin and Tom Pendergast responsible for the Art Deco buildings, or were they just the people that we say are responsible? We have many photos of the construction of the Art Deco buildings, and supposedly we have many accounts. Although, oddly enough, no one seems to provide a first-person account. And now let's consider the Fourth Era proper. This is the era that we call the Tartarian era. This is the civilization that preceded ours. There was a hard reset that occurred in a time frame from 1750 to 1850, although it's hard to say for sure. We have wondrous examples of what the Tartarian civilization may have looked like. Very incredible architecture, stretching to the sky, various forms of producing power. We've explored it in great detail about how this pre-existing civilization managed to achieve a balance between both nature and the artificial implements of its civilization. It also managed to achieve the very elusive balance, for a time, between the individual and society. And that's something that our current civilization tends to go away from in every direction that you can imagine, especially given the fact that it oftentimes defaults to extreme polarizations and someone always having to be right and someone always having to be wrong. And you always have to embrace a belief now, and it's completely wrong to remain undecided about something. We'll still see examples of this Tartarian civilization even in some older images that we have, such as this image that may or may not have problems with it, of an airship docking with the Empire State Building. We also have other examples of airships docking with various towers. So is this really a brief technological fad according to our mainstream account? Or was this a real technological advancement that carried over from the Fourth Era civilization that had to be removed? We've looked at many examples of buildings that still stand to this day that we suspect are from this pre-existing civilization. Consider the Art Deco buildings that we looked at that are very likely from the Fourth Era civilization. We've also explored many libraries and municipal buildings in many cities, such as Terminal Tower in Cleveland. And many people will insist that they have numerous accounts, or because they worked a job in the building, that they can prove that it was constructed by our civilization, even though all we have are some very difficult to interpret images. And once again, we have, strangely enough, no first-hand accounts. Well, I understand the 1930s was a long time ago. And again, we have other images of this terminal tower. And many people will say that they just know, or they know someone who knows someone who knows someone, and that's what they'll say. And if that's good enough for you with the historical account, then by all means accept it. But yet you have many other structures that also seem to defy simple explanation by their incredible architectural style, and all supposedly built during the same time, such as the Masonic Temple in Detroit that we explored. Another wonder of the 1920s, when it seemed as though they built 75% of the buildings in every major city in the Midwest of the United States. We do have a construction photo of it, and once again we see that there are no issues with this construction photo. It is very convincing, and of course that's usually what you'll have when you explore these structures. Remember the wondrous interior that we looked at. And again, I believe this interior gives us true evidence of a pre-existing civilization that has been repurposed and used by the organizations in our current civilization. And here you look at this theater in the same structure, And again, a very impressive and beautiful theater. Certainly there's nothing that we've built since the 1960s that remotely compares to this. This impressive structure in Cincinnati that will be told is an arch or waterworks, it is most certainly not a castle, because somebody says so. And in Cincinnati, where we have this impressive church from the 1840s next to the city hall. And of course, the explanation will be given is that we had those crafty Germans that could build in Greco-Roman style and lay out a wonderful church like this in the 1840s with very impressive columns and the roof that we've seen. And there's absolutely no question about this. You just accept it. Or you can ask questions, such as looking at the Fox Theater in Atlanta, and realize that perhaps all the explanations that were given for who was truly responsible for these structures is not as simple or as cut and dry as it seems. Indeed, looking at the Fulton County Prison in Atlanta, or near what would become Atlanta, we can see evidence of a different civilization. Don't even bother asking why you'd need a tower on a prison like that, because it makes perfect sense. And now we look at the Foundation eras, the third to the first era. Now, the Foundation eras may not seem as dramatic as either the Tartarian era or the Contemporary era because we don't have as much direct evidence. But we still have a lot of direct evidence that indicates that there was an era that preceded the civilization that came before us. And this is in the many examples that we have of what we call star forts, or as this channel refers to them now, geometrically precise foundation structures. And the reason we call them geometrically precise foundation structures on this channel is because they are very geometrically precise. We can tell that these are artificial constructs. And in every major city, there is some sort of documentation that indicates that there is a geometrically precise foundation structure that surrounds the city. And quite impressively so, we can find it in cities across the land. In cities in the United States, in Germany, in Russia, the former Soviet Union, across many other lands. And the explanation will be given for these geometrically precise foundation structures that surround the entire city is because it was good practice. They were defensible. It's how you would defend against cannonballs. And yet, conversely, you can find some structures that had signs of these geometrically precise foundation structures, or the smaller star forts, as you will, during the United States Civil War, which, strangely enough, were overrun or overtaken by a direct tactical military assault. So it's very strange. Once again, it's the example of a conflicting account. Now, you might be thinking, okay, that's fine. You have these maps, and yes, perhaps they were just drawn. And yet we do have actual imagery that shows that these geometrically precise foundation structures at that scale are quite real. There are many examples of them across the entire land. And you can find them around cities, around old fortresses, or at least what we're told are old fortresses or castles, as there are so many castles, since everybody seemed to be able to afford to build one during what were called medieval times. And yet you can see the geometrical precision, and you can see the amalgamation of artificial with the natural. And perhaps this is also the explanation for the large and long, numerous so-called sandbars that we have that run for miles, and in some cases 40 to 50 miles. And you can also see the precision within the remaining structures. There are so many examples of these geometrically precise foundation structures that we can't simply explain, surrounding small towns, surrounding cities, the remnants of what used to be walls. Yet it's integrated with the terrain, and we can also tell that there are buildings that were built on top of these structures in the past. And that's where we get the title the Foundation Era from. It was the third era that the foundation that our previous civilization, the Tartarian era, and then our current era, built on top of, or in lieu of. And when you can see this across the land, and you can see so many examples, it completely contradicts the mainstream account that we're given. Also the fact that it's overgrown and it's integrated with nature. Now, of course, people say, well, there's a reason for it. It was just built before, and it was done with the ability to build walls because there were so many skilled construction individuals during the Middle Ages all the way up to the 1700s. And building these forts, regardless of logistical challenges, were never an issue. In fact, logistics is one of the greatest aspects that's hand-waved away. Now, they explain it with the Egyptian pyramids by saying that the quarry was right there. Well, it doesn't matter if the quarry was right next to the pyramids, which they try to tell us or imply that it was. You still have to cut all those blocks. You still have to move all those blocks, and you still have to form the pyramids, much as you have to form the land and the artificial structures of this geometrically precise foundation structure that goes around what appears to be this settlement and this structure. So is it really that simple to explain, or is it just a matter of accepting what you're told because it's the path of least resistance? And oftentimes that's what we find ourselves doing. And if you assess that's what you need to do to achieve happiness in your life is simply to capitulate to the will of others, then so be it. The second era gives us the example of where we have the pyramids from, and it no doubt reached heights that we can only begin to dream of. Now we suspect that there are a few remnants of the second era. We're told by the very same mainstream account that tells us of how the pyramids were constructed that they once had even more beauty to them, that they once appeared to have a great outer structure. But also imagine if they had this ability to build pyramids, what could they have achieved and how many ubiquitous structures could they have built using the geometric precision of pyramids? You also have to think in a much larger scale too. Because while people will try to say that we never achieved a great building scale, yet we're still able to conceive a larger building scale. In other words, imagine pyramids that would start to match the size of hills or even small mountains, and then integrate a technological component with them. Integrate the aspect of power resources. And when you look inside the existing pyramids that remain, you see a very complicated architecture that went into establishing them. And of course we're told, well, it's because it was a tomb and the pharaoh liked their pyramids and they wanted to have a very elaborate tomb. And the thought of rebellion because they were facing death never crossed anyone's minds. Well, except for a few select individuals. But what if it was very different? What if this was a civilization that existed in even more balance between the individual and the society, and it achieved even more balance between nature and the artificial? And what if what we refer to as the Mayan civilization was actually just a component of the second era civilization? What if all the descendants that came from it and its long timeline actually came from the second era? Think on this. Instead of this being a less advanced civilization, this was a far more advanced civilization. Again, it flies right in the face of what we're given from the mainstream account that provides us depictions such as this. And depictions such as this, even though no one will ever do a practical experiment to prove how possible this is, that will convince us that this was how the pyramids were built. But what if they had construction techniques that we have absolutely no knowledge of? The ability to produce construction materials that far exceed anything we can begin to imagine. And we're not even talking about the original Rossendale cement, or the Rossendale concrete as we called it, or the Roman concrete. We're talking about something even more advanced than that. And here we have the depiction that shows us what the original pyramids supposedly looked like. And there's no doubt that they had this level of grandeur. Perhaps they had even more grandeur. Maybe they were coated in something that looked like gold. We'll still certainly consider all the other theories that we have, even though the five eras theory seems to be quite solid, at least from our observations. The important thing is that we retain open minds. While we're visualizing what the previous eras, especially the foundation eras, may have appeared like, what we're going off of for our evidence is some of the foundation rocks that we have, many of the other impressive structures that no doubt existed in these previous civilizations. What we see remain are not the full structures in their glory. We see the smaller structures that have somehow survived the passage of time and at least 2, perhaps 3 resets. And something else I'll concede with this 5 eras theory. For all we know, there could have been many more eras. There could have been 10, there could have been 20, there could have been 30, or even 100. And another question might be, well, how exactly does other timelines fit into this 5 eras theory? Well, when you consider the fact that San Francisco is considered to be one of the most exquisite cities of our current civilization, and yet nothing about it even compares with what we had in the past. Finally, let's consider the first era. The first era seems to be the era that we have the greatest difficulty imagining. And the reason for that is because the first era, no doubt, reflected the greatest balance It's safe to say that a lot of what we have in our current civilization encourages us not to ever believe that there were buildings that were the size of mountains, even though we're told that in the future we'll envision buildings that are the size of mountains, and architects supposedly already have. Or did they derive this inspiration from something that existed in the past and was described in the past? Described in many different old accounts of structures that were so large that they actually exceeded the size of mountains. We even have the account of the Beacon of Progress, supposedly just a drawing, a sketch, a concept for an incredible monument that was going to be reflected in the Chicago World's Fair, along with many other wondrous structures. We also have the religious accounts of the great religions of the land that tell us of great cities and celestial kingdoms in the past. Are they really referring to the actual celestial kingdom? Or are they referring to cities that may have existed? Cities in the distant past that really were of a grander and greater glory than we can ever imagine. Because we had a civilization of individuals that had achieved balance between both their individual desires and the needs and wants of a society. You might look at rock faces such as this and you would think, no, it's merely a natural formation. Or perhaps it reflects some sort of old, large tree. And perhaps it does. However, there's another approach that you could say it reflects a once great and amazing structure that's been through 4 or 5 hard resets, or maybe more. The difficult thing about envisioning the first era is the fact that we've had many resets and it's been a long time. Now, how long is that exactly? The main question might be, how many years do I envision in these 5 eras total? Well, we just don't know, and I know that's not the answer that anybody would want, but that's the honest answer, because we talked about in the date paradox how we don't know how many years have passed. We don't know how many years are in each of these eras. 1,000 years, 5,000 years, 5 million years? Could the entire 5 eras only be 6,000 years, or could it be many more, 600,000 years? Is it a millennial reign of only 1,000 years, or is it a millennial reign of 1,000 centuries? Or even a far greater amount of time? We just don't know. And the difficult thing with considering time is how quickly things can become obscured, where we're reliant on other people, governments, institutions that were told relentlessly by other historical authorities that were corrupt, that were, excuse the pun, evil. Evil in every way, shape, and form, and yet we're supposed to believe that they preserved an accurate account of history to hand down to us? Because even if you prescribe to the mindset that all of our current governments and civilizations are completely incorruptible and everything they do is for the good and represents the will of the people, regardless of national divisions that we're constantly given, how exactly can you accept the fact that previous civilizations and governments that existed handed us an honest account? I suppose what I'm saying is the 5 eras theory is the best way that we can visualize what may have come before. And I'm always open to revising it and reconsidering it. And as we continue our explorations, we're going to primarily consider the 5 eras theory, because it does seem to explain a lot of the inconsistencies that we have. Now, if you want to reference one particular publication, one particular guide, or what one certain researcher says, that's completely up to you. And I completely request that everybody in the comments tell me what your honest thoughts are. What do you believe? Where do you think the 5 eras fits into the actual history? Is it honest? Is it accurate? Or do we have other difficulties? Do we have other complexities that we need to consider within what the actual timeline is? The last thing I'm ever going to do, though, is simply give up and stop asking questions and stop exploring, because we've already learned so much, and we've already learned to see the world in a very different way. And of course, there's going to be people, there'll even be institutions that'll tell us that we shouldn't see the world in this way. What did the collapse of the first era really look like? We can imagine it. We can believe it was brought about by some hard natural force, or maybe it was brought about by a natural force and the internal corruption of the people on a long enough timeline. It is indeed a recurring theme in virtually every cultural and religious account that we have in our modern era. Consider what was really lost in the past. And I think that's the greatest theme of this research going forward, and this is why this is a very exciting exploration that we continue. As we go forward, all these theories are just as valid as any other theory, and I don't really have any evidence that discounts any particular theory. Although I will admit it's very difficult to prove the theory that everything is just exactly as we're told it is, and history is exactly correct in every minute detail, even though we relentlessly discuss the problems with that. Discuss the Watchers of the World. Now, what exactly are we talking about with this particular topic? What are we getting after? The Watchers of the World, the Watchers of the Wall, people that are just standing idly by watching things? Well, what would people be watching? Are we, in fact, in a society where we are encouraged to be watchers? Has that also been something that's transpired ever since the advent of television? Whatever the incipience of that really was. I mean, there are some arguments that say that television began in the 1800s, but we know that's not true, right? But I always found that this little particular piece of artwork, and yes, to be fair, it's been featured by other alternative explorers over the face of time, but this one always spoke to me as well because it gives you that impression of some individual who just seems to be sitting in a very relaxing chair, a ridiculously high back chair that doesn't even seem fitted for them. I mean, when you really look at the detail of this artwork, and you can certainly do the reverse image search on your own and look at the biography of the artist, it's quite intriguing, but I just want to look at the image at face value because there's a lot of nuances in the detail. And panning back out and looking at it, we see this individual who does not seem to be part of the goings on in this image. Now, we can, of course, talk about the vast disparity in size between the observer and the observee, so to speak. But what's really going on within the action? Well, we have several what appear to be dwellings, houses, or are they places of business? Are they government buildings? Or are they all the above? It appears to be all the above. But you notice the detail that they are arranged in a vertical hierarchy. How intriguing. And yet they also represent a horizontal hierarchy, so to speak. And you have these individuals here on the surface going about their business and they're being watched. What exactly does it represent? Now, like I said, you can look into the history of the artist and what they intended behind the work of art at your leisure. But, sometimes we get that where we have a work of art, but then fortuitously or for other reasons, it may represent other things. And I ask you to look at it and tell me, what does it really mean to you? What is this image where we have this strange individual that's watching something? Is it underground? Is it something else? Is it a representation? Is it someone who's actually watching a giant screen? Is that another way to look at it? And of course, that's why I ask you just to look at the image without looking in the background behind it, because I don't want it to cloud any of our perceptions, because it can. Griff report on X. Wow, that looks like the Man with No Faces temple, but with buildings. Oh, Game of Thrones, how fitting. That has come up quite a bit this last week, but these things always come together, so. Nick, is that what really lies below our surface? Could it be? Or is it somebody who's actually watching us? Oh, that's a good one, Win. It's the Antiquitech store. Yeah, maybe so. Go and view and see what you want to get and even select your group of people along with your particular house and your dwelling. So many interesting impressions just from this one work of art. And I think this is why art can really, really convey a lot of the images and feelings that we have. And yet, strangely enough, our reliance on, how shall I say, computer-generated artwork tends to remove many of those dimensions. Now, I'm not saying it's bad. I'm just saying that the human emotion that tends to be conveyed from previous artwork that we know was actually done by human beings tends to be a little lacking. And, we can discuss the reasons for that. I mean, yes, because a computer did it, but this was actually done by a human being. And what was the human being really trying to represent in this work of art? Now, in my previous days as both a teacher and a bureaucrat, yes, I worked as a bureaucrat in the past, so people can go out and call me out in the comments about that too. Please do. I'm happy to take it. But I noticed that there were many people who would regale experiences or recollect experiences of being watched in some way, shape, or form. Now, you could say that that's something from the way that we're brought up. Most of us, or many of us, are brought up to believe that there's some sort of deity. There is a God, there is Allah, there is all the other names that we have for it watching over us. And so you could just simply say it's a matter of socialization. That, in other words, because we all have this mentality that, and even going back in time, whether you want to consider the pagans or whoever, there's a higher power watching over us. The Greek gods, the Roman gods, those strange pantheon of gods that we see that for some reason are in a Capitol building built in Iowa in the 1800s, and nobody really pays it scant notice because, that's just kind of the thing that you put in your Capitol building in the United States. But it's an odd consideration to really think about how we've been socialized and why we have that in our minds, that someone's watching us. Yeah, there you go, Texas Redneck Hippie. That's actually a great comment there. I feel watched when watching my watch. And funny that you mentioned the watch, because the actual pocket watch, we could argue, is one of the first devices to, how shall we say, implement control over the individual. And what has the pocket watch evolved into? Why, it's evolved into the smartphones that we all carry with us. And, are we going to pretend that nobody's actually watching us through the smartphones? No, people are actually watching us. That's not a conspiracy. Our phones are tracked. Their locations are tracked. We can share our locations with others, and we certainly know that our locations are tracked. And we'd be fools to think that everything that we say is not being recorded by our phones and our computers. There's nothing remotely paranoid about it. It's an incontrovertible fact. And we know which agency likes to use the word incontrovertible, don't we? Oh, don't worry, KC933. We're getting to that concept of what is time even. But we know that scheduling, the component of time, is something that's imposed upon us. And if you didn't have a watch, then how could you abide by it? For example, if I didn't have my pocket watch back in the 1800s to tell me that it was going to be 2 p.m., then I wouldn't have known to switch the train tracks and not crash into the other train coming the opposite direction. At least that's the official explanation we get for the original railroad chronometers and their accuracy, and so on and so forth. And there you got a good one from Sky Sage right there. What we see, we believe. Very true. If we see time, whether it's the time displayed on our smartphone or whatever device you're using, and we all use devices. I do too. I'm not above it. And the old pocket watch. It is what we believe. Our lives are dominated by time. Old world templates for the Matrix. No doubt about it. And maybe it's just a template that's been repeated many times, Griff's report. That's a great comment. So, anyways, I thought this is a really good image, though, to really kick off the entire concept, because what we're going to do is explore who and what these watchers may be. We're going to ask who and what they are, because it could be possible that they are deities of some sort. Or are they more advanced humans? Or are they just humans like the rest of us, and for some reason or for some method, they operate in a different area, a different reality, perhaps a place that we can't access physically but does exist physically, if that makes sense. So open your minds to all those possibilities. And we're also going to ask, why would they be doing this? Is it possible that they're influencing our perception of time and, dare I say, our perception of history over time? Are they benign? Are they good? Are they evil? Do they have good intentions? Do they have evil intentions? Or are they just simply there? Neutral, if you will, or something that's even a power that's so far beyond us that they actually perceive us as just little beings going about our work, as you see in this image. Maybe even like we watch ants with relative interest, and yet at the same time, not many of us actually concern ourselves with ants, although I've certainly come across a lot of alternative researchers and other people who do concern themselves with the welfare of all living things, and I can certainly respect that. Just looking at the different perspectives. And so that's what we're going to examine in this exploration. Now, there's another concept of watchers that I wanted to bring up, and I felt that this little piece of artwork represents it very well. The possibility, the presence of watchers with us all the time. Because there's that argument that we don't just have physical bodies, and again, whatever your particular religious beliefs may be, or even your beliefs in general may be, that there is an ethereal existence that we have, that there is a spiritual existence. And is it possible that there are other beings that exist in that other plane of existence, if you will? There's many different ways to say it, and we can approach it from a science perspective, we can approach it from a religious perspective, or we can even approach it from both at the same time. But is it possible that there are beings that are actually watching over us in terms of what we do every single day? And thoughts on that? Is that a model? I do wonder. I do wonder. Oh, KC933, Slender Man. Yes, the concept of the Slender Man in and of itself. Seeing things. Hey, thanks, Elusive Truce. I really appreciate that. And you played no small role, and appreciate you being here all this time. And yes, I do recall you were here at the very early live streams almost 2 years ago. So, pro pagan da for a non-Christian father. And I'm glad you brought that up, Vaughn, because guess what? That's also a belief system that's been with us for a very long period of time. Again, if official history is to be believed. Ooh, Nana, yes, the man in the black hat. So there's many different ways to look at this. You know, whether it's the Slender Man, whether it's the night terrors, the individuals in the shadow, or the shadow creatures. And again, keep your mind open to all possibilities, because they might be malign, they might be dangerous, or they might be benign. There's all sorts of accounts. And oddly enough, it does seem to depend on the person who's actually relaying the story to us. Yes. And, you know, it's interesting how people try to say things and try to impose their own will on things, and that's something that you see all the time. RB, I would like to make a citizen's arrest on the Watchers. If only we could do that, wouldn't that be enjoyable? Oh, there you go, Tunguska charcoal painting. Yep, Michael's looking ahead, no doubt about it. So, oh, you know, hey, Brian, we could already be in a Westworld scenario, wouldn't know. Funny that you say that, because once again, it's as though you all have an idea of exactly what I'm going to be talking about before I talk about it. It's just crazy, isn't it? And Nana, I have stories that would curl your hair. I have no doubt about it. And I've heard many stories that do, in fact, send the chill up the old spine, as the saying would be. And whether it's the concept of external watchers, internal watchers, or someone that's just watching what we're doing. And a lot of people do have that feeling. Golden Child, they make sure we don't alter future important events. Looking at the control element that these watchers may be exercising. That's very, very intriguing. And, you know, there's the old concept of angels and devils on the shoulder, but I'm not going to show that image. Now, I couldn't resist showing this old Salvador Dali artwork here. And you have a child and what looks to be a parental figure looking at a representation of the land, the earth, the realm, however you want to call it. And, you know, for those of you who are going to get all upset because it's not showing a spherical earth, look, I'm limited to 2 dimensions, okay? Unless, again, anybody has a 3-dimensional screen out there. Sorry, I always have to use that joke. But, you know, Salvador Dali almost played the emperor in Alejandro Jodorowsky's adaptation of Dune. And if I messed up the pronunciation, that's okay, because Mr. Jodorowsky said something nasty about Frank Herbert's work. So maybe it's just as well we didn't get that 14-hour-long Dune movie. But again, looking at the artwork and seeing this interesting concept of some sort of unique being, and whether you want to think of it as a god, a demigod, or even an entirely different species, it does represent this concept of watching what's really going on with the entire land, the realm, the earth, however you want to think of it. And here we have something that's even trying to get out of it. Coincidentally, something that just happens to be positioned where North America is. I'm sure that's not a coincidence, is it? Oh, that's a good one. Michael, breaking down the reality, man emerged from earthly ties. Yes, and that was the beauty about a lot of the artwork with Salvador Dali, is that you would see many different meanings, many different interpretations, and that's something that I sort of miss from having that. Oh, the world egg. Yes, that's another good call out there, Black Cat Occult. Oh, it would have been spectacular, QCZ. Well, everyone's entitled to their opinion. Maybe it would have been. I don't see how a 14-hour-long movie would have been practical, but you know what? If they would have found a way to pull it off, maybe so. I just always had the impression that it was never intended to actually be brought about as a movie. It was intended to bring about the creative impulses that ultimately inspired a lot of other things, which they did. And that's something that will always be remembered about it. But I mean, if you look at what they were going to pay old Salvador to show up as the emperor, you really have to question how exactly was it practical. But, you know, maybe he just didn't have any limits on money, or, you know, he had some really good friends that could float him infinite loans. So, anyway. I don't remember being born. Some people do and some people don't. I do not. So anyway, moving on from this concept of the egg in the world, we also have the concept of the Watchers from Marvel Comics. And I'm only bringing that about because, pretty much everything from Marvel Comics actually has its origin, its inspiration in earlier folk tales and earlier concepts. And who were these Watchers? Well, these apparently seem to be some sort of divine beings that had incredible amounts of power. They weren't supposed to interfere directly in the events of the multiverse. And I know, the Marvel Cinematic Universe, people are familiar with it, and they're familiar with the multiverse concept. And goodness gracious, has that gotten a lot of play in cinema recently. Although the real terror of the concept never seems to make it to screen. I can't imagine why. But if you actually go back and you look at the original comics and this concept of these Watchers, they weren't supposed to interfere. But they did monitor events, and not just in one single universe, but in multiple universes. So multiple parallel realities, which is what makes it very, very interesting. Well, there you go, KC933. Great way to put it. Tesseract verse, going back from A Wrinkle in Time. And again, I strongly recommend just reading the original book and bypassing all adaptations. But maybe you like that movie, and that's okay if you do. I'm just suggesting you read the book because the ideas that Madeline L. Engel had in that book were quite incredible and do represent this in many ways. So, great question right there. Where are they? Good question. Do they exist, again, in some sort of realm that we can't even access, some sort of physical reality that's really out there? Or is it about, I'm not sure. And who knows exactly how long any of us are actually going to be around to know exactly what the Watchers are really about. Yes, the fifth dimension. That's a good way to put it. And it's funny, The Adjustment Bureau, that was a movie that didn't get a lot of attention to it in the right way, now did it, but it did have a lot of the ideas. Don't worry, we'll be getting to one of the most notorious examples here relatively quickly. So again, just looking at different examples, gods, deities, and of course I'd be remiss if I didn't mention some of the old ones, or the concept of the old ones. Yes, the Cthulhu mythos from H.P. Lovecraft. The concept that there might be what we would perceive as horrific beings out there that have tremendous dimensions of power, or at least tremendous dimensions of existence, omnipotence, omniscience, the ability to see everything, but do they even care? Because you may recall that according to H.P. Lovecraft, these old ones didn't necessarily concern themselves with the affairs of humans. Going back to the original image, they just saw humans as some lower form of life, or at least some uninteresting form of life, to put it euphemistically as possible. And so therefore, that's exactly what they would show and what they would see. Oh, well, who cares about humans? They're basically like ants. We've got more important matters to attend to. But is it possible that they could be watching? And whether they're watching with interest or not is very, very interesting. Sky Sage there. Cthulhu reminds me of Leviathan. Yes, and I wonder if that's by no small coincidence. And of course, it depends which version of Leviathan we're actually talking about. So, Vaughn, the lines or veil becomes thinner the more we know. Yes, quite true. And where we go beyond concept to reality. Now, moving on past the old ones, and remember, we're just looking at different possibilities. Is it also possible that when we consider things such as multiverse theory, alternate realities, and so on and so forth, could it be possible that these Watchers do have the power to meddle or intervene in ways that we can't even begin to imagine? Is it possible that they change things in ways that we don't even see? Oh, here's an interesting comment here from Omar. They watch their cattle from afar. Perhaps if they reveal themselves, we would know where or whom to retaliate or direct our attention to. Yes, that's quite interesting. And it's a very good point, because it seems like there's a lot of things that divert us. Now, are they farming us for food, as RB says? Is there some sort of harvesting of an energy, perhaps? That's always a good and interesting theory. And is it possible that they create many of these lands just for that very purpose? That's a very distinct possibility as well. And Wynn's leaning ahead as well. Mandela, or the Mandela effect. It's just a psyop. But could it be that the reason that we have these inconsistencies is not because of a memory or a psyop, but because, for whatever reason, certain individuals have the ability to perceive the change, and the change is going to endure? It's hard to say. Yes, loosh harvesting. Which, if you watch the original series Star Trek episode Day of the Dove, with guest star Michael Ansara, who played a very interesting Klingon Kang, certainly not something we'd see later, again, in my opinion, and you actually saw that battle really play out, and that odd, it being Star Trek, they'd call it an alien entity, but maybe that's really what it is. Some sort of strange interdimensional entity that is doing just that, harvesting energy. So, Sonny, they need our participation. And perhaps they do. RB, humor glitches them. Yes, they don't like laughter. They don't like soft-hearted sarcasm. They appreciate endless criticism, endless disgust, and endless rampant hatred. At least that's what's shown in that Star Trek episode, Day of the Dove. It gets stronger when there's acts of violence and hatred. And what's even more interesting is you have this little creature or this entity that's even influencing members of the crew. Sort of like Mr. Chekhov actually having a brother who never even existed, and yet he wants to get vengeance for him. And we have to ask that question, is it possible that such a thing is implemented within all of us? So that's always a good point. And, we never see any ideas like that in current Star Trek. What's even more interesting is that was in the 3rd season of classic Star Trek, when the show was pretty much hung out to dry. Now, is it possible that these Watchers might have a completely different biology or be a completely different life form? Absolutely, that's always on the table. Because who knows exactly what that may represent? And again, we don't have any limitations in terms of what may actually be existing out there. Whether it's the land, or whether it's different elements of the land, or different times entirely. So, those are always the things that we need to think about and consider. Above is below. Yes, as above, so below. Or is it all just one big circle and one big cycle that we can't get out of? That's always the interesting question. And then going back to the old concepts of the biblical representations of people being watched, because remember how the angels are represented? They talk about the watchers and so on and so forth. And I think what we all have to be very careful, though, is that there are a lot of ideas that we get, how shall we say, shepherded into. And then, of course, we adopt those ideas as our own. Or as they would say, it would be the meme. Is that really what a watcher is intended to do? To get someone to go a certain direction? Simply exercise influence and not direct control. So I'm not going to grab your shoulders and turn you to look to the left, but I'm going to tell you you should look to the left because there's something very interesting, and therefore you're going to look to the left. And that's what one of the big debates is on what exactly is the power and influence of the watchers. Anne-Marie Miller, looks more like judging than watching going on here. Very good perception, Anne, but you know what? How many people will change their perception because they've been judged? Or perhaps I should say because they allow others to judge them, because they concern themselves with what others think of them. And suddenly it's just another, how shall we say, more complicated yet more effective way to get someone to look to the left or look to the right. And it's actually a lot easier to do than we like to say or we like to think. I believe they're called the custodians. Yes, that's another term I've heard. And perhaps that's going off of having more of a controlling influence than we realize. Now, moving on from this deity perception, there's also the classical concept of the Greek gods. And, we honestly have a lot of inspirations that we draw from the 5 ages of humanity that comes from classical Greece, and what was really the role of the Greek deities, or the original Greek deities, who would eventually become the Roman deities. Again, that's according to the official history. I mean, who knows about the veracity of that? I always found that interesting. And yes, we're going to explore that little detail here in a little bit. But what I found fascinating about this, John, could they be the disembodied spirits of the Nephilim? Maybe. Or maybe the Nephilim are just simply other beings that are just being watched and influenced just as we are. They just might be different beings. Who exactly knows for sure? But what interests me about the Greek myth that we have is the role that the gods and the goddesses, because that's what they were in the Greek myth, originally the descendants of the Titans, how they would play out and not just watch, but also guide actions that were going on in the mortal realm, as they called it. And, I always think about, and one of the reasons why I'm such a big fan of the original Clash of the Titans film is, well, okay, look, you got Laurence Olivier as Zeus. It's really hard to beat that, okay? Laurence Olivier and the presence that he was able to convey, but also the imagery in this film, I thought, did a wonderful job of really capturing the concept of what we would see as Greek gods. I mean, for me, this was always one of the basic templates. And even way, 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 way back when I was very young and reading these myths, I always thought that this film, and yes, I'll be honest, this is a film that came out in 1981 and it looked like it was made in the 1960s. But that's okay, because it gave that impression that it was a mythical film. And I always thought that the way that they portrayed the gods and goddesses in this film was just quite frankly perfect. The interplay, the drama between them, and how they would try to influence events. Now, they did the remake of Clash of the Titans, and look, I'm a big fan of Liam Neeson, really, really enjoyed him in Excalibur and all the other movies that he did, and, we won't talk about the fact that he's going to be in Naked Gun, the sequel nobody asked for here pretty soon, but I always thought the issue with the remake of Clash of the Titans is they really removed virtually all the drama and the interplay with the gods and the goddesses. I mean, yeah, there was a little bit between him and Hades, but it was really perfunctory. It didn't play part in the plot whatsoever. And yes, he looked great in his suit of armor, but there was just something about the way that they conveyed it in the original film. And one of the most interesting images from the original film was how Zeus, portrayed by Laurence Olivier, had this incredible display of all of these figures that represented all the mortals and even the demigods, because you may recall his son Perseus was technically a demigod, half god, half human. That was the definition of it. And what he would do is he would take these figures and he would basically portray them in the amphitheater, and that's how the power and influence of the gods were exercised. It was very, very interesting. And it's actually a direct representation of what you'll see in the classical myth. Now, is it representing something that may have really happened, or is it just all one incredible coincidence? Not really sure on that one. They should have kept the owl as is. Yes, absolutely. Good old Boo Boo. But, they made fun of Boo Boo in the new one, and then they were riding giant scorpions 5 minutes later. So, make of it what you will. But I always found that this whole concept of, being able to modify mortals, and you may remember when they did Calabas's transformation, which, by the way, they didn't even bother showing in the remake or the reimagining, it was very horrifying. And it was just done with a little bit of a shadow, how he was turned into a mortal mockery for his many crimes. It really gave you that impression. Now, before we move on, some other concepts of who may be the Watchers. Yes, I'm going to mention the Star Trek The Next Generation episode, Who Watches the Watchers, where we have a technologically advanced civilization watching a civilization that's not as technologically advanced. Now, is that something that can happen, even in our current practical 5th era? Homunculus, yes. Well, that's another whole possibility. And are we homunculi, Sky Sage? Good question right there. But one of the things I remember from this episode is, you get the ideas of how these civilizations that are just so technologically far apart would potentially interface with one another. You have the concept of the duck blind, or where the Federation is utilizing an observation post. Of course, in this episode, it made sense because the observation post was very isolated. It wasn't right next to a settlement. And, they had a malfunction, and one of the locals just happened to be waltzing by with his daughter, went and checked it out, and he got zapped. And then the episode is dealing with the consequences. And then, of course, you may recall it was where Captain Picard was seen as a god, because the guy who was zapped, they beamed him up to the ship, Dr. Crusher saved him, and he thought that Picard was a god. Show them, Picard! He called him the Picard. And, Patrick Stewart played it really well, and you may recall the end of the episode where, yes, Sliko, I will gladly get shot with an arrow to prove my adherence to the Prime Directive. Gee, pull it out, pull it out, pull it out! So, yeah, and then they brought back the duck blind again for the less than sufficient Star Trek Insurrection movie, where it didn't make any sense because they parked it right next to the settlement. I never understood it. But the final concept is the Watchers could just simply be a more advanced civilization. And they might be something that are able to watch in on us because, again, they have technology to access different realities, different lands that perhaps we couldn't access. So it's just one of those very, very interesting things. And so those are all the different concepts that we have of who the Watchers may be. Gods, deities, other beings, or just simple, regular humans like us, who might just simply come from a more technologically advanced civilization. And there you have it. That's a good one, turned into Charlie Sheen. Yeah, that was all about the same time frame. So anyways, let's move on to the concept of the long game. And what are we really talking about with the long game? We're talking about the passages of time and planning on a much longer timeline. Because one of the things that we're limited on, well, at least we understand ourselves to be limited on, is our relatively short lifespan. You know, how long does the average human being live? Well, some people will tell you 70 years. It depends where you live. The life expectancy varies dramatically, so on and so forth. Leo, maybe proof of time travel. That's a possibility too. But looking at the long game, what you're talking about is planning on a much longer timeline than we can begin to imagine. Because what if there are beings, you know, again, whether you want to think of them as gods, deities, or more advanced creatures, or again, just humans that have more advanced technology. There's so many different ways to look at it and what the reality could be. Imagine what kind of advantage they would have if they're able to plan on a much longer timeline. In other words, they're able to plan out events not by decades, but by centuries, by millennia. Why is it that every belief system wants to confine us to a single millennia? Why is it everybody so obsessed with 1,000 years? Well, you're not supposed to think beyond 1,000 years. That's why. Because if you actually look on the long enough timeline, you might see that there seems to be a lot more of a very intentional design behind it. I know. It's simply the work of the Almighty, and the Almighty moves in mysterious ways. And yes, if you want to believe that, be my guest. But isn't it interesting how we seem to be constrained in terms of how we view time? Or then there's going the other direction with it. It's scientific, and we've got billions of years of history, billions and billions, which, by the way, Carl Sagan never actually said, but he did say billions a lot because he was describing time frames in terms of billions of years, because that's how long evolution took. And the less we talk about, you know, the transition phase when the tube evolved into the fish and so on and so forth, and why there's no fossils of, you know, the rapid animated GIF transforming. And I'm not going to show that and insult any of you because, you know, you can watch Cosmos if you want to see it. But, you know, why don't we find that? Well, because we say so. But really just think about how different things could be. Is it really that long of a timeline, or could things have been very different in the past on a much shorter timeline? In other words, instead of billions of years, we're only talking about a couple hundred years, that the entire nature of the land was completely different. Well, there you go, Steffi. Yeah, resets, constant resets. And not just physical resets, but also resets in our mind, because is it possible that our entire society can be reset? Have we been through a few resets? Well, we can certainly debate that. You know, what we talk about is our hard resets, where the entire nature and order of the land is completely changed. Sky Sage says it very well there. A controlled timeline. A controlled timeline or a controlled cycle. In other words, stepping far enough back. Because while it seems like we have two extremes, we have one school of thought that tells us that existence is only about 1,000 years, or maybe 6,000 years. And then we have another school of thought that tells us that existence is, about 5 billion years. Very, very little room for compromise. You know, either one's right or the other's right. Yeah, we have that in our civilization too. You know, everyone's either absolutely right or they're absolutely wrong. There's nothing in between. There couldn't be a third option. You only have two options. Yes or no, positive or negative. There's nothing in between. That comes up a lot. But yet, when you consider that there might be a possibility that just say, 20, 30,000 years ago, or again, remember that time's imposed on us, what we think of as 20, 30,000 years, the land, the entire reality that we're in right now was very different. Now, of course, the scientific perspective will tell you, of course, it was very different. There was Pangea, there was Rodinia, there were all the different supercontinents. The entire world was an ice ball, a lava ball. It went through a lot in 5 billion years. You know, and here you can see it on this geologic time spiral digital illustration that they like to use with all of these cool names that they have for these gigantic time periods, the Paleozoic and the Mesozoic, and oh my goodness, the Jurassic Park, Triassic Park, all the cool names that we have to think of time frames where we do admit that there were very large creatures on the face of what we call the Earth, but we also say and will ridicule anybody who says that such a thing would be possible now. Yes, of course, there were very large dinosaurs roaming the Earth in the past. That's absurd now. It's also absurd to think that there could be very large colossal trees. That's just completely absurd. I mean, that was millions of years ago, or even billions of years ago. On a long enough timeline, anything's possible, but to suggest that anything is possible that's outside of the, how shall we say, accepted mentality, that's just absurd. No, it's not controlled thought and it's not authoritarianism. It's just simply good science. But that's exactly how they'll show it. And yes, the concept of the supercontinents. Now, I want to step back, though. I want to consider it from a different perspective. What if it were possible that all of these extremely dramatic changes that we think of occurring over millions or billions of years actually occurred on a much shorter timeline? Is it possible they could have occurred in only hundreds of years? Or even just a few thousand years, for whatever reason? Because of the vast nature of the realm actually changing? What are your thoughts on that? Well, I don't know, Albie. I've never actually seen a dinosaur. It's a good question. How do you explain that dinosaurs were large reptiles? Who knows? And yeah, I've been in museums and I've seen dinosaur bones, but you know what? I don't know if those are the actual dinosaur bones. Because if those were real dinosaur bones, why in the heck would they display them in a museum? Just asking questions there. I mean, I don't know. Oh, Heidi there. That's a good one. Like maybe 15 minutes. And Vaughn says it could happen in a second. How would we know? Very, very true. If you go with the concept of memories that are induced or implanted, yeah, we'd have really no way to know. So this is one of those things that's very interesting and intriguing. Yeah, and it comes up, and let's be honest, dinosaurs are very popular with kids, and that's one of the first things that you're taught to think is really, really cool. I'll just use the American terminology in school. Dinosaurs are cool. We talk about dinosaurs all the time. Oh, Sean here. Super weapons may have played a part in continents being separated. That's a possibility too. And weapons that we can't even begin to imagine with their controlling power. And so really think about that with this concept of planning things on a long enough timeline. And I show this particular image of this naturally formed rock here in this animated screenshot. And, we can come across rock that might just happen to resemble large life forms. Some of you might recall that horse that we saw in Kentucky a while back, but it's not really a horse. It just looks like a horse because it's naturally formed. You see, this isn't really a dragon that you're looking at or some other large, dangerous creature. It just looks like one. It was all formed by natural processes. Just like this arch thing down here, all formed by natural processes. It's just erosion, and that's all it is. It couldn't possibly be anything else. Or it could be possible that is exactly what it is. That it looks like that's exactly what it is. And on a long enough timeline, with very extreme changes, Heidi with the Godzilla comment, yes, very good, Heidi, it could actually be a life form that changed over time and was brought to that state of existence, if you will. So it's just another way to look at things. It's keeping your mind open to all possibilities, which is certainly not something that we're encouraged to do. And then there's this other concept, lost eons. Now, why do I say eon? Because really that's what we're dealing with. An eon is considered a very long period of time, but nobody knows the exact length of that period of time. And so eon is actually a great term to use because we don't know how long this has been. I say 5 era theory. Maybe I should change it to 5 eon theory or infinite eon theory. Who the heck knows? But is it possible that there was a civilization before ours that was much more advanced, that had tremendous capabilities, that could access other lands, other realities, even had the ability to master the concept of the human mind and manifesting itself in physical existence? With forms of science and technology, at least what we'd call science and technology today, but maybe in the past It seemed like magic. And if you go back and you watch that Star Trek The Next Generation episode, the dialogue explains it very brilliantly. And I dare say that that was kind of the high concept of Star Trek before the interesting developments of science fiction shows that occurred in the late 90s. So, yeah, and Jamie says it very well right there. Plenty of evidence to indicate such. So, anyway. That's the whole concept, though, of the long game. We're talking extremely long timelines. And this goes back to the concept of the Watchers. These are beings, creatures, gods, demigods, angels, Nephilim, whatever, however you want to think of them, that are in existence throughout this entire time. And therefore, they are able to plan, influence. At a minimum, they're watching. They're benign if they're just watching. But we believe that they're doing something much more. That they're doing something much more insidious. And we'll actually talk about what it is that they may be doing. And we're going to talk about the concept of who or what are the Watchers. But before we do that, please be sure that you hit the like button. And so, who do you really think of as the Watchers? What are they? And we've alluded to it many times, but what are we really getting at? And here I start with this little representation. Hold on, let me go full screen on this so you can see it a little bit better. And so, do you think of these beings as some kind of divine beings? Are they deities, or are they something else? Oh, Sean. Fallen angels. That is one of the main theories or perceptions behind them. Absolutely. Or the Anunnaki. Ah, yes. Well, what's interesting is that particular term is something that was used during the 20th century, and I haven't talked about this yet, the 20th century cover-up of the entire concept of Tartaria. Oh, Jamie, Shazam. That's a good one. Oh, that's an interesting comment. Yeah, the Watchers could also be creators. Sky, Yellow Imperator. Interesting concepts here. Oh, maybe like the Q from Star Trek, yes, or Q. Jean-Luc, I've always watched you. We've been watching humanity for a long time. Of course, I remember how he appeared when he showed up in Encounter at Farpoint. That was a very interesting episode, to say the least. Ah, interesting comment here from Nana. We're more powerful than they are, just need to understand the concept. I agree with you, Nana, and granted that's just an opinion, it's a belief, but I agree that we're a lot more powerful than we realize. That's why we constantly have people who are spending all their time trying to bring us down any way, shape, or form, telling us when we can or can't laugh, or I just don't think that your laugh sounds genuine because, I've never laughed in my life. Ooh, interesting from RB here, just a different form of source consciousness. That's possible as well. Let's look at some more representations of who the Watchers may be. Now, we talked about the whole concept of the old ones, Cthulhu and so on and so forth. And could it be that there are beings out there that are just simply so far beyond us? Or maybe we should say it this way. They're so different from us that they wouldn't really concern themselves with intervening in our affairs. Which, going back to that whole Q reference from Star Trek, Jamie says it there, gods of entropy. Yeah. They've got other grander concerns that they're more focused on and wouldn't bother wasting their time messing with human beings. Ah, win right there with the Archons. I'm going to be exploring the Archons here before too long. Very, very shortly. So, Clara, the Watchers look after us and care about us. And that's the benign perception. And that's absolutely a valid point. And it could even be that there are Watchers that look after and care about us, and there's Watchers that want to bring us down. And it could also be that there are many Watchers that are indifferent. So, ooh, Carol, ourselves from another dimension. That's another way to look at it. And that also goes back to the whole concept of the spiritual or ethereal self that we have. Good comments, everybody. So, appreciate you sharing. Jamie, one side wants the universe moving and full of life, the other wants it cold, still, and empty. And that does seem to be a lot of the conflict, if you will, that we run across in many ways and shapes and forms. And then, of course, looking at the different representations of the great old ones. And you see them come out in many different forms of media. And yes, they've been represented in the comics, whether it's Marvel, DC, it doesn't matter. Many of the science fiction stories, there have been many different dimensions of this. But the original origin, apparently, came from H.P. Lovecraft. And H.P. Lovecraft's concept of the great old ones and where they showed up. There's also the other realms of spirituality to really consider, the actual existence of human beings or great enlightened human beings. And there's always that debate. A lot of people think, well, are we talking about gods? Are we talking about demigods? Or are we just talking about very advanced human beings? And I think when you really look into a lot of the mythical concepts that come from places or associated with places such as India, the concept of the origin of Hindu and Buddha and so on and so forth, you probably get exposed to that ideology or that belief system a little bit more. And maybe they do represent more the concept of the benign watchers, if you will, who will influence and intervene on your behalf. And it's also possible that some of them have a more insidious intention behind them that we just don't know, such as when you consider some of the more Lovecraftian concepts. And while some people might think of the Lovecraftian concepts as just aliens, it seems to be the way things are going now. Everything's either aliens this or aliens that. But it's interesting to me. Ooh, Rafi with an interesting comment here. They live eternally through our incarnations. They also hide from judgment in us. Very, very interesting. And quite possible there as well. In the Sky Sage, look at the chaos they construct. And that's the evidence we have of the more insidious watchers or those that are intervening in that particular manner. So it's all many different interesting perceptions that we have of them. And here it is, and I couldn't resist. Yes, the original film Westworld and then the first season of the TV show Westworld. That was summer of 2016, or at least what we think of as the year of 2016, if memory serves. And I remember how intriguing the first season of Westworld was, the TV show on HBO. All these different ideas, but really the same interesting concept. And, here you have this digital model of the theme park, Westworld. And if you're not familiar with the concept in the film and the TV series, it was about the future where humans would go to a theme park called Westworld, and they had hosts or androids or cyborgs or robots, however you want to look at them as, who were there just simply to take care of all their needs. And the humans could do whatever they wanted to the hosts. They could kill them, they could assault them, they could inflict any kind of terror they wanted to on them. And then the series, the first season especially, explored the idea of how these hosts handled all this, with their memories being taken away and removed and basically reset for every experience. But I find the whole concept of Westworld with the people that are really planning this entire theme park, those that are planning all these stories and these guests, the humans that go through them and the hosts or the robots that serve them. Now, I certainly recommend the original film because that's where the idea came from, and definitely watch that. And it's always fun to see Yul Brynner back in the day and really get the idea of what it was. But really think of this concept, how this could really represent what we have going on with people who are watching. Do they really have an insidious intent towards the robots? Or are they just there and they're used as a tool and that's how people see them? So many different perceptions. That's what makes it so interesting. Robert, final season of Westworld reflect the world people walk into if they lead with fear. That was one interesting idea from the very end of it, yes. I wish they would have kept that complexity through the entire series. But again, that's just my opinion. Maybe you find great worth in the rest of it, and that's completely okay. I do think it started off very strong and complex, and I really appreciated it at first. So, anyways. And then, the Delos corporate map, which just happened to match the levels of hell from Dante's Inferno. I'm sure that was a coincidence there, but when you look at it, the actual layout of the Delos corporate offices, and you can see it, livestock management. Remember, the livestock in Westworld were also androids as well, or robots, however you want to look at it. Old disused facilities, cold storage, arrivals, monorail terminal, archives. So this entire layout for where these individuals the Watchers would actually operate out of. And again, going back to the reference of a biblical reference, was Dante really talking about hell, or was he talking about what he saw as some sort of layout where there were insidious Watchers operating? Don't know for sure. It is interesting, though, how Dante's Inferno is used as the primary modus operandi to incite the fear of hell. And that's certainly one of the basic tenets, if you will, of religion. Fear, 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 fear. Now, I couldn't resist going to the whole concept of a little film that came out in 2012 called Cabin in the Woods. And the premise of Cabin in the Woods, spoiler, and if you haven't seen it, well, then tune me out right now. But in 2012, it was considered more of a pioneering horror film that had horror cliches. We see a group of college-aged people staying at a cabin in the woods, and then they have terrifying monsters that come after them. But we find out that the monsters are actually being run by, well, this guy and his partner. Yeah, just some black tie, short sleeve, collared shirt wearing guy who is making all these plans with these monsters to attack these teens as they're trapped in the cabin in the woods. And you realize that things aren't exactly as they seem. Now, how do I rate the movie? Does it compare to classic horror? No, but, I'm old and I grew up with different movies, so maybe I just look for different things. Did I enjoy the movie? Yes. Did I think the movie had some very intriguing and terrifying ideas? Absolutely. And are these guys who are actually arranging all this, because, the plot of the movie is this is an organization who's designed to set up these horror events to appease the ancient ones, or these gods that live beneath the earth. And over time, there's an agreement with humanity that they have to do these sacrifices. They have to make them more elaborate. And that's why they all play out like by the numbers horror films. Although if you go back and you watch the classical horror films, they do all the little things right. But again, that's just my opinion. Maybe you think the modern horror films are great. But yes, this individual and his team, part of the organization, their entire purpose in life, they are the Watchers, but they're just working for somebody else. Working for somebody else to facilitate an agreement. The film is very interesting, though, because it illustrates this and how this arrangement may be working very directly. And has anybody seen Cabin in the Woods? And it's a more recent release than what I usually talk about, so... yeah, I tend to agree with John. It is a lot of schlock, so... Leo, yes, new twist on ancient pagan religions. And that was actually the way that the... Oh, thought I dropped off for a second there. That was actually what we understand to be pagan religions. Although, is that what really happened, or is that just what we're informed? In other words, were they big on the human sacrifices? Or are we really the civilization that does human sacrifices in different ways? Oh, Amy Jo, Stonecutters, you must be talking about that Simpsons episode. Yes. Who keeps the metric system down? Who made Steve Gutenberg a star? Just think of that anytime you watch The Day After, right? And it's really interesting if you watch this film, Cabin in the Woods, and you think about this crew that's facilitating all of these sacrifices and what they're going through with it right now. Oh, there's a good comment there by Sooner West. Right now I'm getting Billy Madison vibes. Yes, that too. So very, very true. But that's what you see in this film, though. What the Watchers may be and who they are. Just human beings that are doing a job and going about it like it's a Monday 9 to 5, right down to wearing ties and seeming really schlocky. Hey, look, is that Chris from Adventures in Babysitting? I think it is. So cool. Oh, yeah. I mean, I remember during this film they had this interesting marker board, and, they had all these plans and all these monsters. Oh, what's that? I guess they were fans of, is that referring to Arizona? Or is that referring to Corona, the beer? I mean, this movie came out in 2012. I can't imagine that it's referring to anything else. But just very interesting that appears in the film. And no, I'm not making that up, and that's not a modified image. So I have no idea what the heck that's referring to. So, Eric, I just watched the movie. Yeah, and it is appearing on Amazon Prime right now for some reason. So, so Clara thinks it's Corona, the beer. Yes, I agree. It's definitely Corona, the beer. What else could it be, right? Yep, it all appeared in that film. And so, who or what are the Watchers? Gods, demigods, angels, higher beings, or just haggard workers in their white shirts and their black ties, going to work, drinking coffee, and shooting the breeze at work about what's going to happen. It's really, really interesting when you really think about how it could really play out. So, now, let's consider evidence of existence for the Watchers. Wait a minute, you're saying there's evidence of existence for Watchers? Well, yes, there actually is evidence for existence of Watchers. But first, I wanted to start off sharing something, and I always try to keep my themes and concepts and values consistent on the channel, at least for as long as I'll be around, and who knows how long that'll be. And I just wanted to share this little saying with you. Avoid the crowd. Do your own thinking independently. Be the chess player, not the chess piece. Because what you'll find out is, whether you believe in the concept of Watchers or not, or higher powers or anything, it is safe to say that there are plenty of interests out there, whether we want to say they're individual people, or organizations, or institutions, or, the stonecutters, or whoever. Avoid the crowd, do your own thinking, because there are people that will happily use you as a chess piece. And you owe it to yourself not to let them. You owe it to yourself not to let yourself be checkmated as a chess piece. Because you don't want to be a pawn that becomes a queen, because guess what? The queen is still just a playing piece. That's why the saying is, you want to be a chess player. It's a great saying, and I just thought I would share it with you. And that's why I'm going to laugh when I darn well please, because I enjoy laughing and having a good time. Now, I wanted to highlight something because there was a saying in the 1800s during the conflict for this little piece of land that today we call Afghanistan, the nation of Afghanistan, and this is the Khyber Pass you're seeing. Now, right here through the Khyber Pass, which is on the border between Afghanistan and Pakistan, yes, I'm relatively familiar with it, and we don't need to discuss why or how, it's not important. But it's interesting to think that this is also where the Silk Road ran through. And they once had a functioning train that ran through this area too. Now, of course, we're talking about mountainous terrain, you can see it, but it's just something interesting to think about that they called this conflict in the 1800s the Great Game, where the British Empire was competing with the Ottoman Empire and the Russian Empire for influence possession of Afghanistan. And strangely enough, these conflicts continued all the way to this day. Officially, the United States only very recently withdrew from Afghanistan, interestingly enough, and, left the same political party in power that was in power before the United States went in. And I'm not questioning it, just saying, officially that's what happened. Hey, Brother Adam, good to see you. But the Khyber Pass, a very interesting area to study historically, especially with some of the interesting structures in and around there that tends to be overlooked. And, pay attention to the natural terrain. It's very beautiful, and there's nothing unnatural looking about it at all. You may recall a live stream in the distant past, it was last September, where we talked about the concept of a great game, about how there may be someone who's using all of us as just simple chess pieces. Although, is the real deception of the game are institutions and organizations chess players, or are they pieces themselves? Now, yes, we like to use the analogy of chess, but there's many different analogies for it. Because what if the organizations themselves are actually also just pieces that are being used? What if the stonecutters, whoever that may be referring to, I have no idea, is actually just another piece on the board itself? In other words, the organizations are also being played as pieces. And if that's the case, then who's actually moving the pieces? That's what we're referring to with these watchers. Somehow, some way, having an influence that's able to do it. And you'll find other older representations of what we would think of as distant civilizations in the past. And that's exactly what they'll tell us, is that there was this sort of influence going on. So, Dallas, that looks like it should be a Judas Priest album cover. Well, the previous image was actually a Triumph album cover. And I did feature it before, but if this current one, I could see Judas Priest using this current one, beyond any shadow of a doubt. So, The Wizard of Oz, Sky Sage, always a good example in and of itself. But this concept has been with us for a long time. Now, there's also another concept that relates back to alchemy, and I've never really talked about it before because for whatever reason, it's really pushing things to, well, we'll just say the outfield. And that's the concept of the chronomancer. Yes, apparently in alchemy, there are examples of individuals that were able to manipulate events and time. Or, dare I say, they weren't necessarily time travelers as we'd think of them as, but these were individuals who were able to influence events in time. Now, how does this connect with the Watchers? Well, if there actually was chronomancers, if they did really exist at some point in time, who would operate as your best, how shall we say, doers or executors? Yeah, I know that's probably not the best word to use, but the individuals that really make a decision happen. In other words, the ones that employ the action that conform to the decision that the Watchers want to have happen. The measurement of time, the Shar was a day, not a year. And guess what? The measurement of time changes all the time, too. Great example. Jonathan Strange and Mr. Morrow. Many, many examples of it, but yes, you do see it come out in different ways. Yeah, this particular artistic impression Sky Sage has a little bit of a vampiric element to it, I agree. Because, were they benign or did they have evil intentions? Who knows for sure. But you'll also find other representations of it when we consider evidence of existence. Because if there was somebody or something that was really imposing its will on a previous civilization, or even our own civilization, which we could make the argument that there really is, then that furthers the evidence of existence, that it's all over the place. And going back to the Khyber Pass, and the whole reason I show this particular image is here we have the elephant battery of the heavy artillery with the Great British Army, well, at least the British Army that operated out of India, going across the Khyber Pass with their great elephants. If anybody watched the Mile High exploration earlier this week, we saw there was an elephant corral in early Denver. Why was there an elephant corral? I don't know. I guess elephants are great animals to haul heavy things through the mountain passes. Who the heck was using animals in the United States in 1860? Don't ask me. But then there's also the incipience of other things that seem to have been planned on a long term. For example, the current civilization's complete stated reliance on fossil fuels. And here we have the great oil derricks of the Caspian. And that exists to this day. And, I can recall in the 1980s, 1990s, everyone is always talking about there was going to be a shortage of fossil fuels. Shortages expected by 2000. Prices are going to skyrocket. Well, once again, I'm not going to tell you what to think, but, everybody complains about the current price of gas. Just go and wherever you are in the land, compare the price of gas now to the price of gas in 1981. And, of course, factor in inflation. And tell me, what's the relative value of gas? Boy, those shortages should have crushed us in the early 2000s. Indeed, Sky Sage, indeed. But, just go to the gas station. They're fossil fuels. And for some reason, we haven't run out. Yes, I know, the official explanation is we've done more explorations, we've developed new methods to harvest it, and that's why we have such an abundance. It's just one of those little details that a lot of people don't think about. And I'm just asking you to think about it. Oh, QCZ, that was a wonderful movie. Yes, There Will Be Blood. Daniel Day-Lewis as Daniel Plainview. And really, what was that film actually about? Did that film have anything to do with oil, or did that film have something to do with something else entirely? Great example. Jamie, it's not fossil fuel, it's self-replenishing primordial fluid that the Earth makes. Well, that would probably make more sense, at least with the cost of it, wouldn't it? But look, Jamie, just because something matches up in terms of making sense doesn't necessarily mean it's true, right? Atom Bomb, what about Ice Age? I was told was coming in elementary school. Oh, yeah, I remember that back in the late 70s. I even remember that In Search Of episode with Leonard Nimoy. The Coming Ice Age. We have some terrible winners. Yeah, that was what they called it back then. It makes it quite intriguing. So... anyway, but what this really shows, though, is that this entire paradigm for existence has been in place for a long time. And it seems as though somebody or something had this in mind for a very long time. Unless, of course, you just want to accept the fact that it fortuitously developed. Oh, yes, and the Khyber Pass also has an entry gate. You see, it doesn't matter whether it's a pass, a city, a town, a village. You need to have a very elaborate entry gate. I just thought that was interesting. And by the way, we all think of the original Game of Life that a lot of us played, and maybe some of us didn't, but apparently it was around in 1860, and here are some of the most depressing squares from Milton Bradley's game. Suicide? Yeah, apparently so. Crime to prison. Oh, that's not so bad. Gambling to ruin. Jail. Well, it's like Monopoly there. Just ruin. Poverty. Intemperance to poverty. Intemperance. Disgrace. Oh, look at that. They've got the dunce cap on. Prison, where you must lose one move. Yes, the original Game of Life. How intriguing. You know what I'm surprised they don't have on here? Asylum, or institutionalized. And, they could even say, somebody didn't like you on the bottom of it. Yes, I'm being very, very facetious and very disturbing, but yeah, I don't remember that either, The Watchers. I mean, I just remember the little spinny wheel, and it was a fun, happy game, and, either you succeeded quite a bit or you succeeded a little bit. But, yes. Well, a lot of people aren't aware of that with the Game of Life, but just think about that. What if there is someone or something that's really playing that kind of Game of Life? Because guess what? These terrifying fates do still happen to people. And, we can overlook it and so on and so forth. But, are there chronomancers? Are there individuals that can really influence events? Do they have the ability to do so? Here's a little bit of a less vampiric impression, Oh, I like how they have airships back here just coming out of this one. Yeah, I can't imagine why I picked this one. And a little bit of this nice, impressive old world structure behind this chronomancer here. So just imagine that. Complete change of timelines, altering events, going from one possibility where there was a land with airships to a destroyed land and no airships because of one disaster. How intriguing. And you can look at some of these interesting maps of Western Asia where this great game played out and look at the names and look at the political boundaries at the time and compare them with modern political boundaries and the so-called modern great game. And I'll really ask you, how much has changed with it? I mean, this is from the mid-1800s. Has this great game really changed that much? And you'll say, well, of course, we've got the United States involved, the greatest military expeditionary power. And if you ask anybody who serves or has served in the United States military, the greatest military in the history of the world. I mean, nothing wrong with having a little bit of confidence, I know, but, there, like I said, wasn't a different result in Afghanistan than when the Soviet Union went in there. But, it's very, very complex. And look, I don't mean to be making light of the fact that that's been a very war-torn area. And there's been a lot of suffering there. The point being is there's been suffering there for this entire time frame. So why is that the paradigm? Why do people just accept it? It's very interesting. Well, we have strategic interests there. But why is it always a stalemate? Why do things never really seem to change? That's the only questions I'm asking. And if you look at some of these early art impressions, here, this is the Khyber Pass again, you'll see some very intriguing things, especially with the way the land is depicted and some of the structures on the land. Now, I'm not going to show some of the more elaborate artwork because that's not what this exploration is about. But again, it goes back to the theme, is somebody really just keeping events on a pattern, on a paradigm? Why is it we always see conflict, assimilation, indoctrination? Yeah, Sky Sage says it very well there. History is hypocrisy. Ever so true in many ways, in more ways than one. So, Watchmen. They're all controlled and installed governments. A very interesting theory there. Well, certainly you couldn't be referring to the current Western governments. I mean, we know those are free, democratically elected governments, right? I'm sorry, United States, we're constitutional republic. We're constitutional republic. We just happen to have an election all the time, but whatever. Think of it what you will. And so, does that provide evidence of existence of Watchers? Are there people that are really manipulating things? Or are there interests that are manipulating things? Does it follow a design? Well, I mean, the evidence is the fact that there's really been no change in the broad course of events. The same things are happening. Conflict, assimilation, indoctrination. You could argue that World War I and World War II were a little different. They were larger scale conflicts, right in the name. But was every single nation involved in World War I and World War II? Well, the argument would be yes to some extent, more so World War II than World War I. But at the end of it, did anything really ever change? Or has it just always been the same, replaying and repeating all the time? Now, to close out this little exploration on the Watchers, I wanted to talk about the eras or the eons of humanity. I know what you're going to say. Oh, he's going to show us that blasted 5 era slide again. Well, I'm not going to start with that, actually. What I want you to think about here is the whole concept of what we're informed how time developed. Now, we go off of the Julian calendar, at least primarily in the Western Hemisphere, and a lot of people may not be aware that the Julian calendar came from Julius Caesar. Maybe they are. I mean, it's in the name, so. Oh, that's a good one. You call them watchers, I call them stalkers, says Rose. Yeah, it's probably more appropriate. If somebody's watching, they are stalking. You can definitely say that. Adam, did World War II ever really end? We could make the argument, no, it never really did. It evolved into the Cold War, and then that evolved into the modern conflict between East and West. So maybe it didn't. Who knows for sure, Brother Adam? Who knows for sure? But you look here with Julius Caesar, and I want you to think about this. So the official history tells us that in the 1st century BC, before the birth of Christ, again going off of official history, Julius Caesar and Rome were going through this very difficult time because they didn't have a calendar that worked for the harvest. That's what the official history tells us. The harvest was happening at the wrong time of the year. It was supposed to happen in spring when the crops were harvested and there would be lots to eat. But they had to reform the calendar. And as a result, what you'll see is, if memory serves, it's the year 46 BC. How the heck anybody can know that, I don't know. But that's stated to be the longest year. Although it's interesting because what exact dating system were the Romans using to track the years? That's always a question I've had. But we understand that we operate by the Roman calendar, but what year was it for the Romans in 46 BC? Because at that time frame, they sure as heck didn't recognize Christianity, did they? And so that's where things get very convoluted. That's where you really have to question, what's the real start of the time frame? And thank you, Sooner West. I appreciate that, and welcome to the new members. Thank you very much. Yeah, there you go. 13 months back in the day. And who knows for sure? Again, this is what the official history is telling us. Excuse me. But that's something to ask. Also, when you look at Roman coins that are documented to be from that time, and defenders of the mainstream history will tell you are definitive proof that history did happen as we've been told, there's never any years on Roman coinage. I can't imagine why. What year was it to the Romans? I don't know. Somebody could say so. Hey, that doesn't look anything like Joaquin Phoenix. Ugh. Never mind. But hey, look, I think you can actually see the eyes, though. So a little bit more than you see on a lot of those bizarre statues. And remember that the Romans, we understand it, were master engineers. And if we recall the Battle of Masada in what is today Israel, we have a historical account that the Romans built a massive ramp to reach the Jewish settlement of Masada to besiege it and to ultimately assault it. And you can still see the evidence of that ramp that they built. And you can watch the miniseries Masada with Peter O'Toole. It's a pretty good miniseries back when they did miniseries in the 80s. I know, long before these 6 and 10 episode specials on Netflix. But so the Romans were capable of engineering feats. They could do coinage, but they didn't exactly know what year it was. They had to reform the timeline. They had to completely reform the conduct of the year so their harvest would match up to when they'd expect it to happen. So they were this screwed up. And we're not even talking about all the civil wars, all the conflict, all the internal strife, the fact that it was reliant on forced labor. And yet they were also competent enough to, in war no less, build this incredible ramp that allowed them to get a siege engine, a siege tower, up to the top of this very difficult, severely restrictive terrain. Now, we know how the story tragically ended, according to the official history. But how is it the Romans were able to do all that, and yet they had no idea what the year was, and they had all these problems? It's what I like to consider one of the biggest conflicting accounts. Yes, we could build the Pantheon, but we're not exactly sure what a year is. There was a civil war here, there was Nero, there was all these other issues, but yes, the year is not important. Nah, who needs to know the year, right? Very good point there, Leo. And so, if you look at this, our five eras theory, the possible timelines, what if it is all part of someone's grander plan or grander cycle? The Watcher's great plan or great cycle. And we do have cycles that appear in the Mayan long count calendar. Although, how applicable is it? Did everything change on December 21st, 2012, or are we all still here? Or did something else reset? I'm not really sure. Whether you're looking at the Mayan calendar, or what's supposed to be the Mayan calendar, or the Aztec sunstone. I'm going to share something with you I've always found very interesting about these studies of the Mayan civilization. We have no direct accounts of the Mayan civilization. We don't have any survivors from the civilization that communicated records to us. We found some ruins and we assigned meaning to them. That's what I've always found very, very interesting about it. Now, people will claim that yes, they know exactly what civilization was all about and what it means. Although, in my mind, there's problematic elements that the official history has, much as it does with the Romans. So it's really hard to say. Does it represent something else? Could it mean something else that's completely beyond us? And whether you're looking at the wheel existence of the inner ring or the outer ring or other representations of it, it all seems to follow the same pattern. It's giant cycles. So, anyway, get to that in a second. But what are your thoughts on cycles of time? Kathy, it's all made up. Yeah, there's probably a lot of truth to that as well. So, yeah, there you go, Sean. Another group that just vanished. And there isn't a direct connection with them. Now, there's a big space and time, much like with the Romans. There's not a direct connection with the Romans. There's something else that happened. There were other peoples, other civilizations, other cultures that took over when that great civilization fell. That's what makes it very, very interesting and why it's very difficult to ascertain what's really happening. Vaughn, trauma promotes cycles even mentally. So very true. So very true. Anyway, so could it all be the doing of Watchers? Is it evidence of Watchers? Are they on a long timeline? Are they creatures? Are they gods? Are they divine beings? Or are they just people who go to work 9 to 5 and can't stand their jobs and suck down coffee and talk about how much they lament the fact that they have to do something? Welcome, channel members. Now, I know that originally I stated we were going to be looking at several observatories and observatories overall. However, I recall from one of the very original live streams in the nascent days of the channel, back when I still called them Aurelian's Fairs, we talked very extensively about Yerkes Observatory. This was the summer of 2023. Now, if you don't remember this or you weren't with the channel yet, no worries. We're going to cover the background real quick. Yerkes Observatory is considered one of the flagship observatories, and it's located in Williams Bay, Wisconsin, a village on the north side of Geneva Lake. A very peculiar location as it's right in between Illinois and Wisconsin, and it's in Walworth County. And Lake Geneva is a well-known city/location for many estates and many meetings of, let's just say, various political figures from both Illinois and Wisconsin. It also had a very interesting status during a particular time frame in 2020. And if you're curious about that, let me know in the comments. We've talked about it quite a bit. But the background on Yerkes Observatory, more than 125 years, billions of galaxies, couldn't resist Carl Sagan, and yes, Carl Sagan is connected with this place, surprise, surprise, right? And still counting. If astronomers had a walk of fame, it would be here. So of course it involves Carl Sagan, right? An observatory destined for greatness. In 1892, a brilliant young professor of astrophysics at the then new University of Chicago learned of two 40-inch telescope lens blanks collecting dust in a warehouse. They were just what George Ellery Hale was looking for, of course he has 3 names, to build the observatory of his dreams, because everybody wanted to build an observatory in the 1890s apparently. I mean, why not? You could build anything in 5 minutes. You could move 11,000 miles of rail track in 36 hours. He convinced the university's president, William Rainey Harper, again 3 names, remember that, to acquire the lenses and secure what was essentially a blank check from Chicago tycoon Charles Tyson Yerkes, 3 names again, to build a different kind of observatory. Yerkes Observatory, housing not only a telescope but also laboratories, or laboratories if you're British, workshops, and libraries, first opened its dome to the night sky in 1897. and soon attracted the brightest lights of astronomical science. For nearly a century, a virtual who's who of astronomy surveyed outer space through the Yerkes Great Refractor. Sherborne W. Burnham, hey, look at that, we actually have an initial there, cataloged 13,665 star systems. How exactly did he do that? Never mind. Edward Barnard discovered the large dark clouds of the Milky Way. Optician Frank Ross introduced the wide-angle lens to astronomy. Edwin Hubble photographed the first evidence of the expansion of the universe. Again, something else apparently you can see from the observatory. Nancy Grace Roman, 3 names there, NASA's first chief of astronomy, did her graduate work here, as did Carl Sagan himself. And so there is the background of this observatory. The birthplace of astrophysics. Now, I'm not going to go into astrophysics with you because, yes, it's an interesting science. It's a branch of science that uses the principles of physics to understand the makeup of celestial bodies. Yes, indeed. And so here we have it, the background of Yerkes Observatory. Astronomical in every way. Equally stellar architecture and grounds. So, founded by the University of Chicago, yet built in Wisconsin. Does that make a lot of sense? And, of course, we have the pictures of the individuals involved, all with 3 names, and I'm sure it's a coincidence. William Rainey Harper, George Ellery Hale, Henry Ives Cobb, any relation to Ty Cobb? Maybe, maybe not. And Charles Tyson Yerkes, major donor, a cutthroat financier who developed much of Chicago's elevated railway. Yerkes saw an opportunity to rehabilitate his image by underwriting the initial construction costs of Yerkes Observatory. Ah, yes, as everyone was doing during that time frame who was a tycoon, robber baron, I'm going to rehabilitate my image by giving money to some particular cause. So why didn't he give a bunch of money to, I don't know, maybe a bunch of government buildings, thousands of them across the Midwest? No, just this observatory. Nice stash on that guy, too. Tracking the milestones, and here's our little timeline. At almost every turn, astronomical and scientific history was made at Yerkes. Follow the path of these important developments. 1893, the tube of the Great Refractor, exhibited at the 1893 Columbian Exposition in Chicago. And there's the famous or infamous picture, depending on your perspective, on the right. And then, of course, the Chicago World's Fair, featured on the thumbnail for this because I am saving the real money shots for when we actually look closely at this very impressive location. Construction of Yerkes Observatory begins in 1895, and 2 short years later, it opens and it's officially handed over to the University of Chicago. Handed over to the University of Chicago? I guess that's from the financier actually signing the deed to the University of Chicago or some formality, who knows. In 1909, first ever photograph of Pluto inadvertently taken at Yerkes, not recognized as notable at the time. Yes, what is Pluto exactly? Is it a planet? Is it a body? Is it just something called Pluto? Is it a dog? I don't know. Help us continue the legacy. And so there you have the background of Yerkes Observatory. Now let's take a closer look. And you're going to find out there's a reason why I wanted to focus on this particular location. This has to be one of the most stunning old world sites that I've come across. That's right up there with the Plummer Building in nearby Rochester, Minnesota. So let's take a look. And of course, we begin by looking at the dome. Now, interestingly enough, you can already see that this is very ornate and detailed for a simple observatory. It appears that we have brick and or block construction with a lot of ornamentation. Now, very interesting that we have the columns, and they do appear to be quite sectional, even the smaller columns. Very intriguing. And then we have the archways that are well decorated, as are the top of the columns. But then you can really see the decoration here with the leaf motif, or whatever you want to call it, for the unique symbol that we just can't identify that comes up a lot. Now, keep the theme of symbols in mind because they do play a significant role in this exploration. Now, when you go to the actual top of the dome, and it should be noted that there is an official renovation that's going on. There have been many renovations, as there are for all old world structures, and Yerkes Observatory is no exception. You get the impression, though, that the dome is very much something that was likely constructed and or renovated by our current civilization. Now, I haven't been up there, and I haven't been able to do my own personal assessment on it. I do intend to, But whether we actually do an exploration on that or not, well, I'll leave that up to you. But it is very intriguing that you have all this little detail here and all of this enduring construction. And then something about the dome just feels that it's, I don't know, maybe just a little haphazard, or half-hazard, as I like to say. So moving on to another image, Yerkes Observatory, University of Chicago. And doesn't that just feel very tacked on there? Almost like they put those blocks there on the front and that was the best they could do. Look at the font on that, very intriguing. And then of course we have our year, although oddly enough not on the same block, 1895 or 1895, when they started construction presumably, and finished in 2 years. And here you can get an idea of some of the impressive detail in this structure. Look with the detailing on these particular columns. And of course we have our favorite cartouche. Now we'll look at some different perspectives. And it looks like we have either a griffin or a sphinx creature over here. I'm just going to go ahead and, well, maybe it's not necessarily a griffin. Oddly enough, it looks to be more like a sphinx creature. Maybe something in between, or maybe an earlier version. You're going to see some very unique things with the symbolism on this particular structure. Well, I always enjoy how people get worked up about that. And then the sphere up here, very intriguing. And yet we have different, it looks to be some animals moving on the sphere, but it looks like we've got an individual. So all this for an observatory, constructed in the 1890s. What else would it be? This is a very impressive view here, and this just gives you an idea of how detailed this all is. So they were rushing to complete this in 2 years, and they had to put on all this ornamentation, all this detail. And how is this done in 1895? And of course I'm asking the same questions. And you can see we have some faces up here. Why? Well, it looks like we've got the horns and hands, so very intriguing. And even up here, it looks like we have the cartouche symbol that's actually on this archway here, and other intriguing decorations. Now, what material is this? Well, could this be another example of the more advanced construction material? Something that was produced potentially by alchemical processes? I'm leaning that way. The interior is no less impressive though, because you'll see they still put the same detailing here on the top of the columns and the archways, and some very interesting symbolism. Now we'll look at some more high definition images here at the top of these particular pillars. But again, you can see all sorts of effort put into the detail. What do these symbols represent exactly? I'm not sure, and I certainly invite you to let me know what you think in the comments. And oddly enough, it almost has a state capitol or county courthouse feel to it. And this is an observatory. And again, you can see this very ornate decoration and detailing. So 2 years and they were able to finish this, and then put in this very, very interesting light up here, the skylight. And of course, decorate the way to the dome up here. And then it looks like there's some, I don't know, maybe these were originally supposed to be portals or what? I definitely need to get on site for this particular one, as this is a very intriguing exploration. But it's here in this particular image that you really start to get an appreciation for just how detailed it actually is. And you really get the feel for just how much of an old world structure this is too. And again, we have our little clamshell, I know no other real way to describe it, the concave architecture, but then a unique mixture of stars. And of course, what do these symbols have to do with the United States or astrophysics in the 1890s? And my answer is, once again, I have no idea. Looks like we've got a nice little lion here, and some lions' heads, and we know we do see lions a lot. Looks like the cartouche and the leaf motif, and some other symbols here as well. What exactly is this? Definitely have to get closer. We've got a star and a crescent moon, it appears. All very intriguing. And what about over here? Looks like a lion's head or something else. When you look closer, though, you'll find that there's all kinds of unique figures to be seen. And don't worry, we're going to be examining them. Now, here's a different rendering, and here, with this particular coloring, you can actually see some of the detail better. So again, another winged lion. Perhaps a different sort of griffin, maybe? Or representing something else, or a different era? Who knows for sure?
It's all very, very interesting, though, that it does appear on this observatory. Now, of course, whenever people see domes, they jump to certain conclusions, and yet we get the feeling that the dome was added. Was it always there, or wasn't it? What exactly do these symbols represent? And these are a little bit different, a different variation of the symbols, and yet we can recognize certain similarities with other symbols that we've looked at when we did our extensive exploration. And why, oh why, do you need this kind of detail in an observatory? Well, it's going to be the finest observatory, and this is because of the funding from Yerkes himself. He was a financier, a very cutthroat one. Yes, naturally. So if that were the case, why wasn't he financing more cool projects so he could improve his reputation even more? This particular perspective, though, again, shows you the impressive detailing on every single column and the decoration on the pillars. Now, I've got something very, very shocking with this particular one, and we'll get to it in a moment. But again, this other perspective here on this winged lion, again, there's more human-like qualities here with this particular lion. Yes, it's a Y for Yerkes, or a Y for yogurt. I hate yogurt, even with strawberries. Lion almost looks scared or terrified in a way. Interesting. Kind of reminds me of those frightened-looking eagles that they had on Old Penn Station. Little portal window right there that's very well decorated. And again, more of the decoration on the windows down here. Now, here's where we get to one of the pieces of resistance. Looking inside at this particular symbolism, and you may notice we've got our old leaf motif, a couple variations on it. We have an owl, because what else would it be? Although, is it an owl or is it something else? I'm not exactly sure. But up here, yes. Isn't this intriguing? This symbol here to the left, right next to this symbol on the right. You know what these symbols are. I'm not going to insult you by saying what they are. Did you ever think that you would see these symbols in any structure anywhere in the land, right next to each other? Well, guess what? They're right next to each other in Yerkes Observatory, and you can go see them to this day. And as for the rest of these symbols, what exactly do they represent? It looks like we have the cartouche here in the central position, right above the owl. And this is the reason why I'm always very cautious in terms of what I suggest symbols mean. Because we know that we have different associations, different meanings with different symbols at different times. And those meanings can always be changed at the drop of a hat, at the click of a mouse now, or at the typing of fingers. We can change the meaning of these symbols. I wonder what the original meaning behind all these symbols actually was. And how exactly does one explain these symbols in an observatory in Wisconsin constructed in the 1890s? And why, oh why did anybody go to all this trouble? Now, you get the idea that there are some additions, some slabs of paint here, perhaps part of their quote-unquote renovation process, but yet the rest of it looks like it's holding up very nicely, because we always have this renovation screen to give us the impression that these structures are just falling apart. And look at this mosaic here on the floor, apparently. Very, very interesting symbolism. And not something that we come across a lot, although I guess we could say this is the classic cross. Now, of course, we know what a cross could represent if it's a full cross, but it's not, oddly enough. So it's really hard to say. Is this representing something else with communicating about dimensional reality? And how many do we have around here? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Very, very interesting. Not usually a number we see a lot of with crosses. But maybe there's no significance behind it, it's just a fancy, pretty pattern. But what are your thoughts on it? Does it have some other meaning that we're not grasping? And again, looking on the exterior, we do see that it's a sectional column, but very, very well decorated columns, including the tops. And interesting that the star almost appears to be upside down in a way. You would expect it to be going a different direction. Very, very intriguing and very unique. Now, I'm glad that I didn't look this closely at Yerkes Observatory when we did the live stream. I have a feeling the channel might have had some difficulties back in the summer of 2023. And we can just save it for a member video. And here's where you can see that very impressive pattern, that mosaic on the floor, which is why you really wonder if it has some entirely different meaning. And I've been all over the land, and I've seen all the different religious symbols, and interestingly enough, this seems to have flavors of all of them mixed into one, but maybe that's just me. Maybe that's what's really strange about all this. What does it all mean? What could it all mean? Very, very interesting. Now, looking at the exterior, you can see that there's multiple domes behind it. Now, this dome over here, of course, is the main observatory where they have the great telescope that was at the Chicago World's Fair. But what do you think this structure was originally intended for? Clearly, it was repurposed from something. Now, this is a member video. I'm giving you my opinion, and you're certainly more than welcome to offer counter opinions, and you're certainly welcome to say, no, Aurelian, I think you're crazy. This is something that we built. That's completely all right. Let me know what you think, because I'm always interested in knowing what you think. Now, isn't this intriguing? Here we have different faces, one with quite a beard, almost like this court jester face. One appearing almost sad and somber, and one appearing, dare I say, crazy or insane. But what is this creature supposed to be? And clearly that's what we're seeing. Some sort of terrifying creature. But what exactly does it all represent? All so interesting. How old is this really? Because I'm under the impression this is a lot older than we are certainly informed. And here you can see that owl a little bit better. And yes, I would say it's a very well decorated owl. And then, of course, our symbols that just happen to appear next to each other, where they will appear next to each other nowhere else in the land. Very, very fascinating. And a little bit of repetition, too. I have the distinct impression that this is representing something far beyond our understanding. And that really what we have here are some genuine, old world surviving examples. And of course, it would be in an observatory. Now, I know we were originally going to explore what the actual function of observatories really were, but we're holding off on that for right now because I thought the significance of the detailing that we have in Yerkes Observatory was more important to cover before we do our exploration on observatories overall. But don't worry, we'll be getting to it. I'm just amazed, and I see a lot of this, and I do this just about every day, about what we're really seeing. And here we see the figure in terror and the strange creature up here. It almost reminds me of something I've seen from a horror movie. But I don't know, maybe my mind's just not in the best of places tonight. It's hard to say. And then another look at our winged lion that almost seems to be in agony itself. I'm not wondering if this particular structure was originally built as some sort of final refuge or maybe some sort of final tribute or a warning in terms of what was happening. You know that in different structures we do seem to get a mix of a different tone or theme with many of the images. And I do have a feeling that there was somebody in the previous civilization who had an idea that their structures may well endure past the reset, and they had to communicate something any way that they could. It's always intriguing to think of that prospect and that premise. And again, very interesting patterns here. Now, you might say that these look a little bit more animal-like here. Maybe these are cats, or these are the owl heads, perhaps. And in this particular image, I could see that. But maybe they represent something else entirely. And a very, very strange face. I mean, this doesn't even look anything close to human. Look at these ears up here. I mean, I think that's what I'm seeing, but, let me know what you see. The other impressions always help. I don't know, maybe we all need to go do an on-site together for Yerkes Observatory. I think it'd be well worth the effort. And then, of course, we actually have the telescope, which has been painted over many times. How fascinating. And we have our brickwork, which is quite interesting because the cream brick pattern was available at nearby Milwaukee, and yet we have multiple colored bricks here. Not exactly adding up, is it? And it appears that they've repainted the mighty telescope from the Columbian Exposition. And other odd and interesting figures, such as this centaur or this pan figure, whatever you want to call it. And again, this looking much, much older. Very, very old. And then another one of these figures. And I've certainly seen these figures all over the place as well. So you get the impression that this might be an even older structure. It's really hard to say. That's always the hard part about it. Now here's our construction photograph, and You'll notice that in our construction photographs of Yerkes Observatory, we always essentially have the walls and all the detailing complete, already looking the same as it does today. Because why wouldn't it, right? And the only thing they ever seem to be working on are the mighty domes. Of course, we just have an individual standing up here and, well, at least it looks like we've got some people working. Hey, and look, there's a guy sitting on his knees, right on the edge of the beam. Well, at least he's not holding on with one single foot, right? I don't know. I mean, I could see our civilization being able to build some schlocky dome-like structure. But remember that this was a small dome, and who knows for sure. The rest of it, though, it's beyond question. I do find it interesting, though, that they included this image of the mysterious moon. Yes, the moon is very mysterious. But in this particular case, I guess if you go to this display, the moon will actually appear in 3D, which is very different than when you look at it in the sky. I wonder why that is. Now, that's just an Aurelianism right there. For whatever reason, whether I'm looking at the moon with my naked eye or through a telescope, something about it always has a two-dimensional presentation to me, and I'm not sure why that is. I would expect to see a real ball, if it were indeed a ball. But who knows exactly what it is. And I'm well aware of all the different theories that state that there may be a map of the land that's reflected in one of the moon's craters, and I certainly don't discount that. I'm probably maybe about halfway convinced on that theory having some validity. I certainly don't dismiss it. I think it's a very interesting theory. But in my mind frame, I think there's many more possibilities than just that. What is the moon? Well, we'll have to do an exploration on that as well. And oddly enough, some very strange symbolism here. And here we have another one of these winged lions, maybe, along with an eagle, and some cornucopias with fruit. And again, I'm reminded of some of the things that we saw in the Iowa State Capitol. The same symbolism, too. And then look at this ornate detail. And of course, we have this series of owls here. And whatever this symbol, or is this a creature? I think this is a symbol, but who knows? Who knows what we're really looking at with this? And again, very, very interesting. What is this supposed to represent? It almost looks like something from... No, I'm not even going to say it. I'll let you come to your own conclusions on it. Yes, I was going to reference another movie, but that's all right. I'm just completely blown away, though, by the detail and the age of this structure. This seems much, much older than just over 125 years. But then here you can see how the detail is preserved on these particular columns. Just unbelievable. And yet another symbol over here. And again, a very different symbol. Not the symbols that we've really come across before. So I think there is something a little bit more genuine about this particular structure and what's been preserved about it. Because there's no explanation for why anybody would go to all this effort to put this on an observatory, one that we're informed they needed to bang out rather quickly. But all the details are there, and even up here in the corner. Look, once again, we have this little elf figure, or this gnome, depending on how you want to describe it, with what looks to be, I don't know, a little bit of a sea motif with it. Something from fish, who knows for sure. We seem to see everything, and who knows what was really around in the old world. And of course, I save one of the most interesting images for last, because once again, we have what appears to be... I'm not even going to say it. But the figure of Sol Invictus, maybe? Depending on what particular sun worship you want to go with. And believe me, there's a lot of people who seem to think that I'm an outright sun worshiper. Not necessarily the case, although I do think the sun's very important, whatever it really is, whether it's a star as we think of a star, or even a portal itself, and all those explanations may come into play. Again, with the horses, 4 horses. I think we have a chariot here. And what are these figures behind it? Winged cherubs? Very intriguing. And yes, I'm well aware there could be many interpretations. Is this a goddess of some sort? It could be. Is it another cousin of Columbia? Who knows for sure? Or it's something else entirely. But here again, you see all these owls And what exactly are these figures right here? I don't know. These almost look like some sort of mask or a skull. Very, very strange. All this on this observatory, all this effort and all this detail. And of course, our famous and well known cartouche, and it looks like something was pulled out of the middle of it, and we have a giant crack across it. Probably because this is far older than we can begin to imagine. But again, that's just my assessment. You're welcome to disagree with me. Here's what it looks like in a different kind of light, more of the daylight, more of a natural light, if you will. Trying to see if we can see different things that pop out, because remember, with old world structures, they always appear very different when you change the lighting. Still so interesting. Right down to even how the horses are acting. Almost as though this is some kind of panorama, maybe some sort of battle or some sort of triumph. Who knows for sure? And then, just as a bonus, I thought I would include this particular picture. This is a very interesting image that's purported to be from the 1860s in Ames, Iowa. Now, you might recall Ames, Iowa started off either as a train station or it's where the Iowa Model Farm is, what is today Iowa State University. And you may remember my connection to Iowa State University. But a very bizarre picture with all these individuals, all appearing to be what they would call military age males, and they all appear to be in uniform. And where exactly was this picture taken from? Did somebody else stand on a cart to get everybody to pose? And what's really going on here? And it's just intriguing to me, and you have all these flags, but you don't very clearly see Old Glory as you'd expect to see. Is this the initial settlement of Ames, Iowa, but there's already buildings there? Very, very interesting. Well, anyway, that was just a little bonus, and just want to let you know that yes, there are a lot of questionable photos that are out there that do give us the impression that something very different than our understanding of the official history may be. But what do you think of this exploration, and would you like me to do an on-site of Yerkes Observatory? Thanks for joining me.